John Turner means when he says that housing is a verb.
I mean, I think that he means to say that the people for whom that the project is being initiated should also be equally involved as the people who are building or working on that project. So maybe that.
Okay, but I think it has a more a slightly more a deeper connotation in the sense that housing is a verb as against what? Uh, how is housing generally perceived to be? And what does one mean when one says housing is a verb? But why would he say something like that? Anyone? Have you come across this phrase, housing is a verb?
I was thinking that maybe like a verb is like an action verb, and now we like usually think of housing as like something that is just something that just exists, and if you have the money, you can like pay for it, and it's not like tailored to like any specific individual. But maybe if like the people who are staying there have can do something about it, like they can influence it in some way, that would be better.
Yeah. I think one could say, yeah, that's what he means essentially. But he's very clear when he means, John Turner doesn't really talk about the term that we generally use these days, which is very fashionable, which is called participation. He doesn't talk about participation as such. He's not talking about participation of users in housing. He's talking about a concept which is more fundamental, which is dweller control. Control over decisions that govern your living environment. Now, what would be the nature of that control? Like, how would you know that somebody is in control of their living environment? Most of us, if we get housing, we go and look for it. One second. We go to the market, we look for housing, look at ads, then go and see the housing. It is ready, it is made, already made. You go and choose it, right? It's not very different from going to a supermarket and buying a pair of shoes, except that, of course, it is it's fixed in location and so on. But basically, the mechanism is the same. The housing has been made by somebody else. It has been designed by somebody else. It has been planned by somebody else. It's estimation of how much is needed and how big it should be, and all of those decisions that be made by somebody else. You simply go and choose it if you think it suits your budget and your expectations, right? That is essentially what housing is to most people who at least buy their housing. In that conception, housing is a noun. It's a thing. It's an object. What Turner is saying is that housing is a verb, in the sense that housing is not something that is ready-made, but it is something that people make every day through their practices and their actions, and it is not something that is ready or it's just something that you choose, but it is something that you build for yourself, and build in. I mean, he doesn't mean that everybody is going to actually do the brickwork and this, that, and the other. But it's the whole process of organizing that unit is something that is done by you, by the dwellers themselves, very closely monitored or undertaken themselves. Now, John Turner was somebody who was an architect, trained as an architect, but his main field work was in Lima in Peru. And in fact, he's known across around the world as a authority on informal, what we today call informal housing, housing that people build for themselves, especially the poor, the urban poor. And in fact, he's very famous. He's instrumental in popularizing the idea that self-built housing or housing that the poor build for themselves is not something to be scorned, but it's something to be understood as a way of doing housing. It should be part of the policy of housing, not something that governments try to eradicate, and in a way you'll notice that this is, I mean, today we notice it less because you might have come across people who say this all the time. And in our institute, at least, we are, we believe in this more or less. But earlier, at least, the main way in which governments would respond to housing built by the poor was to simply delegitimize and erase them. This is not the way housing is done. Housing has to be done in a certain way. There are certain standards, there are certain norms, there are materials, construction techniques, and so on, which must be used to build housing. Anything that is built by people themselves is, in a sense, not acceptable. Yeah. So John Turner, in a way, kind of inverted the way in which one was used to seeing slums in the third world, especially. He's famous for that. He's not the first one to say it, however, but he was the one who popularized it most. This view of self-building being a important way that housing ought to be thought about. But he went one step further in that he said it is not only practical. It's not only practical that people should build their own houses. He said that is desirable because in a sense, it is where people have freedom in making those decisions. It's not only because government can't build housing that the poor should be led to build their own housing. It is because when governments build housing or when the private sector builds housing, people don't have control over it. Right? So for him, it was a political aspiration as much as a practical consideration. Today, when you listen to people talking about self-built housing, they speak about it more in practical terms. It is better anyway. It stresses the budget if the government builds so many housing units for the poor, or it's exclusionary, or because the private sector cannot build cheap houses and so on. Therefore, the poor should be left to build their own houses. So there is a certain kind of practicality invoked. But Turner is talking about it as a political act. He's saying that self-building is politically is more is more libertarian than somebody else building housing for you. So that in that sense he means a verb and not so as that housing is a process, not a product. And that is what he's emphasizing. And if you look at how the poor build their own housing, it is actually a process. You first set up a small, you enclose a small piece of ground, then you consolidate it over time, and you invest over time. You don't build it at one go. You don't have that kind of capital to do it. So you invest small amounts of money as you save over time to improve the condition, and it becomes a better and better house over time. So the house is never finished. It's always, in a sense, being made as you live in it, and it changes as the size of the family or the structure of the family changes in response to how your neighbors react to it, and there's always a negotiation over these decisions and so on. And that is a process that he says is very important. It should not be thought of as a problem. It should be thought of as a solution to housing. And so this is essentially what he's arguing. Obviously, this is a small excerpt from a book and 2 or 3 books that he wrote about the subject. So you can check it out. Actually, it's fairly interesting literature. And most importantly, you should remember that this is written in the 60s or 70s. So it's not a new idea. Today, a lot of people talk about self-build as it says a revolutionary, completely new idea that I thought about. But this is an old history. It was something that was spoken about in the mid 20th century, and people are simply kind of invoking something that already is fairly. I mean, many governments actually practiced this even before John Turner wrote about it. For instance, even in Mumbai city, you had government programs for self-built housing. I mean, for whatever problems there were, they did exist. Like MHADA was doing self-built housing, and so on. Obviously, when governments do it, it has more to do with cost considerations. So, it's cheaper to give a patta and put some toilet rather than to build a whole house. So in that sense, not in the sense of political freedom and so on. But these programs did exist, and John Turner simply gave it a kind of a political orientation. So that is what is interesting about this particular body of literature. Okay. Any questions or comments about this? Or we move on to the next?
Hi, Hussein.
Yeah.
I have come. तो मैंने अपने 3-4 जनरेशन पहले जब मेरे ग्रैंड मदर और उनसे मैं स्टोरी सुनता था घर की, तो वो उनके घर के बारे में बोलते थे कि हम लोगों ने घर कैसे बनाया या ऐसा, मतलब वो फार्मर्स लोग थे तो वो खुद का घर बनाते थे, तो उनके स्टोरीज में ये था कि हम लोगों ने घर कैसे बनाया, ये पैटर्न था। फिर उसके बाद अभी हम लोग टाउन में रहते, तो हम लोगों ने पापा जब घर के बारे में स्टोरीज बोलते तो वो ऐसे बोलते कि घर जब बन रहा था तो हम लोगों ने इंजीनियर से डिस्कस किया, प्लान डिस्कस किया, फिर घर का जो पानी मारना वाटरिंग होता है वो मैं करता था, तो वो थोड़ा इन्वॉल्वमेंट कम हुआ, पर वो एटलीस्ट थे उस प्रोसेस में घर के कुछ, तो मतलब घर के स्टोरीज में अब थोड़ा ये आ गया था कि थोड़ा ज्यादा डिटैच हो गए थे वो घर के स्टोरी से। और मैं ऐसे इमेजिन करता हूँ कि जब वैसे मूवीज में वगैरह देखते हैं ना हम लोग, जो लोग फ्लैट में ऐसे रहते, तो उनके पास जब घर के बारे में स्टोरी होती तो बस ये होती कि हम लोगों ने घर के लिए पैसा कैसे जुटाया, या मतलब वही स्टोरी होती है घर। तो वो मुझे लगा कि एक घर के साथ एक स्टोरी वाला जो अटैचमेंट होता है ना, तो वो इसके वजह से धीरे धीरे से खत्म होते जा रहे हैं।
Right, exactly. And I mean, it's very interesting. If I ask all of you in class, how many of you have actually, at any point of time in your life, or are currently living in a house that has been built by, has been self-built? So the one question that immediately arises is, what is self-built? Okay, so you can say that in our current society, most people live in self-built houses. Most people. Okay, I mean, most of our built environment is not designed by architects, planners, or urban designers. You know, it's self-built, which is in fact which is actually a fact. If you think about it, the most poor and the very rich live in self-built houses. The rich in the sense that they're single family homes, you get commission an architect, you tell the architect, this is how I wanted these many rooms, this much space, this kind of balcony, this kind of roof, and all of that. And then the architect designs it for you. Okay, in a way it's self-built. They don't ever lift a finger to do it, but you know, it's completely in the sense of John Turner. You know, they have control over the process. And the very poor who have no means of accessing market housing or state-built housing, so they build their own home. But the entire middle strata and the upper middle strata, they are actually buying houses that are product from the market, right? So has anyone here ever lived in a self-built house? Any hands? No, no one? Nobody?
I do.
Huh? Who?
Sham.
Sham lived in a self-built house. Okay. Sham, where? What is your this thing? Hometown?
Ahmednagar, Jamkhed.
Ahmednagar. Okay. So in any case, Sham, I'm sure you will tell us that most houses in Ahmednagar are not designed by architects, no?
Yes. नहीं, आर्किटेक्ट वगैरह ऐसे कुछ नहीं. रेयरली एक सिविल इंजीनियर वगैरह काम करे, प्रैक्टिस करते हैं, पर ऐसे आर्किटेक्ट वगैरह नहीं.
Yeah, you will hire a contractor, or at the most you will directly contact masons and carpenters and whatever, and they'll come and do it. You know, so you commission people who come and build your own home. So that's essentially self-building, you know, and that's how most people live. Actually, we are a very small section of society, and so that reflects in the class essentially, mostly urban, middle class background. So that's how we tend to generally either rent houses or buy houses that are already made by somebody else. Decisions are made by somebody else. Actually, a lot of people who live in site and services schemes and so on, if you have not bought a house that is already built, if you're allotted a plot and so on, you will also have in a way build your own house, right? So it's interesting to think about this, but it's more interesting to think about housing as a verb, you know, in the sense that it is always something that is being made rather than something that is ready-made, you know. So that's what Turner brings to this discussion. Okay, chalo, let's move to the next piece. And who is going to read it? This is by Robert Goodman.
Can I read?
Yeah, please.
Yeah. The new professional, having rejected the traditional role of advocate planner within the present structure of government, does not mean rejecting the expert's role in creating the liberated society. For the planner, environment making would be used to move toward more humane attitudes by presenting ways of designing, using architecture as an alternative to present oppressive ways for doing this. As environmental professionals, we can begin this process by realizing that our present solutions, our ways of going about planning and designing, have been conditioned in good part by the need to continue our existence as a restricted professional group. Our economic existence and our power relation to other people has depended on this group identity. We can introduce new ideas, even radical ideas, into this guild so long as these ideas can be marketed or managed by this group. We can move beyond this form of elitism by structuring our existence in relation to our social community's needs rather than our professional community's needs. Instead of remaining the outside expert trying to resolve the conflicting needs of the low middle, high income metropolis, or simply helping the poor, we can become participants in our own community search for new family structures or other changing patterns of association, and participants in the process of creating physical settings which would foster these ways of life. In effect, we became we become a part of rather than an expert for cultural change. A step in this process is to explore and make our community aware of the causes of environmental oppression. The nature of how real estate speculation affects design, for example, and to promote the creation of alternative environmental forms. Design opportunities can be used as a way of explaining the advantages of community ownership and management of all income producing ventures, the factories, the housing, and the shopping places. The design of housing, in particular, could expose people to possibilities of designing for themselves and to more communal patterns of living together. A communal building where people share facilities and spaces would present an alternative to the present single family house or apartment unit, an environmental condition based on the duplication of facilities, which in turn induces maximum consumption. The communal or shared environment embodies a cultural change inherently antagonist to the capital tendency to expand consumer markets. Towns such as Kano, Nigeria, and some squatter settlements in Latin America, hardly an adequate model for what would be possible with the technology available in this country, again hint at form qualities of more spontaneous, less, what is this word?
Bourgeois. Bourgeois.
Less bourgeois aesthetic environment. In this architecture, complexity would not result in former preconceived aesthetic attitudes about hierarchy, jazz, pop, or variety, but a complexity where real differences in people's ways of living become apparent by real differences in their life spaces. Instead of buildings designed as visually pleasing objects to be viewed and judged by professionals, this architecture would be an open ended collective assembly of the many decisions made by the people who actually use the environment. But again, this attempt to describe and illustrate the qualities of an architecture which would grow from the experience of use rather than the forms of hierarchy and monumentally must itself be viewed as a way of generating possibilities, not defining outcomes. Not only would apparent cultural and historic differences contradict an adaptation of these forms, but more importantly, the formal environment of a liberated society, by its very nature, growing from the experience of people creating their own environmental world, must necessarily await the opportunity for that experience to occur. That is, forms which grow from the experience of use, of living within these forms, adapting and changing them, should not rely heavily on pictorial qualities which are communicated and interpreted through look at experience.
Okay. Anyone wants to summarize this? What was just read? What are the main points? or even the general perspective of the author? What do you think?
I think he's talking about the role of like the architects, and like how we think that we are doing something for the poor and like putting ourselves on a higher ground when we think that, but we should actually, like, the spaces should be designed by us being thinking we are a part of them, and then the design coming out of that maybe.
Yeah.
And
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true. So Robert Goodman's this extract is from a very interesting book, which is not very popular. It's called After the Planners. And it came out in the 70s or 80s, if I'm not wrong. Yeah, 72. Now, this particular book, you see, this period is also interesting because there was till, you see, after the Second World War, there was a certain high modernist phase in the practice of architecture around the world, especially since there were many in Europe. There were lots of devastated cities that were being rebuilt, and in the post-colonial world, newly independent countries were kind of trying to create, new modern forms of architecture like Chandigarh and so on, new capital cities and all of that. So there was a certain kind of high modernist thinking in the architectural world. And there was a reaction to that in the 60s, especially as a result of the various kind of social movements in the 60s, student movements, working class movements, women's movement, and so on, civil rights. There was a kind of rethinking of, what should be the role of professionals in society. And there was a lot of criticism leveled towards planners and towards architects and so on, as being professionals who are essentially in the service of power, and who are basically the technicians who do the bidding of the people who actually run society and so on. So there was a very powerful kind of critique of this. For instance, you can also see in the 50s there was this, in the US, Jane Jacobs, this kind of writings on the critique of Robert Moses, and just a kind of celebration of architecture, which is not essentially driven by the whims of planners and architects and so on. And so it is in that kind of tradition that Robert Goodman's book is written. However, it's interesting also where he's coming from. So this particular section is actually a critique of an idea that emerged in the 70s called advocacy planning, which was itself a way of thinking about planners as pure technocrats. So till the 60s, planners were thought to be people who were doing something which was almost scientific. There was a science of the city. And planners knew this science. They were the scientists of the city essentially. And what planners were doing was essentially, like in the other branches of science, a certain way of kind of re-engineering the city to make it a good city and so on. So there was this kind of a view of them being detached, value neutral experts. And as a reaction to that, there was a new kind of brand of thinking called advocacy planning, which was basically the idea that actually what planners do is serve clients. And the clients of traditional planners has been the state. And the state hires planners to do the planning. If you look at, let's say, Bombay's development plans that were made in the 40s and then in the 60s and so on, basically planners who are employed by the state to do the city plan, right? So the main clients of the planners were the state or real estate lobbies and so on. So this idea of advocacy planning was that if planners are like lawyers who's serving a client, then they should serve different kinds of clients as well. Clients such as poor communities. If the poor community is a client, you will plan for them, not for the state or not for the market. You'll have a completely different way of thinking about planning. You will think that, okay, so for instance, if you were to work with a informal settlement in the city, you will probably think of, okay, basic services, you will build common amenities, you will undertake some upgradation projects, but that's the planner's role for a completely different client. Okay. So Robert Goodman is actually writing in response to this idea of advocacy planning. And he's saying that, okay, it's not that advocacy planning, I mean, he is skeptical of this idea of advocacy planning. He's saying that planners should actually not be simply advocates for a particular community, but planners should advance more progressive goals in society, and so not simply the people who have hired you, but you should also probably challenge power systems itself. Now, how do you do that within the planning and within the architecture domain? It's even more difficult. But even within planning domain, it's difficult, right? Because you're not really going to. Nobody is going to let you plan a city that is going to undermine its dominant institutions and so on. So those are some of the issues that arise. But he's definitely saying that one should, through their practice, be able to understand and expose the various ways and means in which the built environment itself can be an oppressive force. And that is also the role of an architect and planner. It's not only about building, but it's also about a critical analysis of the built environment. Which is an important task that a architect and planner should undertake. Then he's also saying that architects and planners should not design for communities like advocates. Okay, they should design with community, in the sense that they are a part of a process of collectively building your own environment. They are not simply expert consultants who will only work for people who give them money. So you work with people and you figure out the problems that you encounter and you find solutions to them. It's a more grounded way of thinking about collective, construction of the built environment, rather than thinking that you have some knowledge and people will apply to you when they want that knowledge, right? So he's kind of also challenging this idea of advocacy planning, but not in a very critical way. He's sympathetic to advocacy planning, but he's saying it should be expanded. The idea should be expanded a little more. And there were architects who were working in this tradition. There was a famous Italian architect called Giancarlo De Carlo, who actually practiced this form of urban planning with communities, rather than for communities. So this distinction between working with people and working for people is an important distinction that they make, right? So this is where Robert Goodman comes from. Obviously, he is like John Turner. He sees a great amount of value in people building their own environments and authoring their own environments, rather than decisions being made elsewhere and people simply being able to access those by payment of money or by filling up some form and so on, right? So that's the criticism that he's with John Turner in this idea that people should be very much involved, or people should themselves make their environments rather than the environment being made for them. Yeah. Okay. Any questions or comments on this? Any clarifications? Yeah, one thing that he also says is, if you go down, can you scroll down a little? I think there are one or two points which are also important. Yeah, if you read this book, it's a very interesting book, and one of the chapters is also mainly about architecture. He is very critical of the education of architects. In fact, he talks about how the architecture education is largely about kind of is about internalizing certain kind of norms of a professional. I mean, you must have heard of the whole debate around this new Architects Act, which says that even non-architects can build, and that should be legitimate. And a lot of the architects, the architecture community reacted with a lot of hostility, saying that this is an attack on the profession. And obviously, they are going to do that because the legitimacy of the profession comes from being able to monopolize the practice. As long as architects can say that they are the only ones who can authorize the built environment, anybody who says that other people who are not architects can do it is going to be seen as a problem, for them. So what is the profession? Essentially, he's asking Robert Goodman, and he says that profession is a kind of a system of credential accumulation. You get a degree, you become an architect. Now you are supposedly the one who has a monopoly over this subject, right? And it gives you a certain kind of status. in society, and you are going to make sure that nobody displaces you from that status. And that is what education is about. It also does one more thing. Education also does one more thing. It cultivates a certain kind of taste or aesthetic in your mind as an architect. So you start looking at things as, okay, this is good architecture, this is terrible, And generally, you will notice that whenever you look at things that have been made by people themselves without architects, you tend to have a disdainful view of it. That, oh, this is ugly, because there is no architect involved, or generally it is about rivalry with other professionals. But there is a certain kind of social or class interest or professional interest which shapes the way in which you look or even appreciate the built environment. So you don't think that settlements built by people themselves are worthy of being called architecture. Architecture is something that you see in glossy architectural magazines. Architecture is something that is publishable, or these days Instagrammable, whereas other things are not aesthetically exciting, or so you also acquire certain tastes which are a reflection of your social class as well, right? So he in fact kind of goes through this whole process of how certain kinds of imagery of architecture it becomes a certain kind of benchmark, and this circulation of ideas happens through exhibitions and magazines and so on. And this is a very interesting chapter, which is a very strong and very powerful critique of the profession itself. So you should definitely check it out. Yeah. Okay. So that's all I have to say in the form of a summary. Any questions or any comments? I mean, you should have an opinion about this. I'm essentially talking about your profession. What do you guys think about this idea? That architecture is that education is about cultivating certain tastes and about acquiring status.
It makes sense that people should be able to build their own houses, but maybe like, I don't want to sound elitist or something, but maybe it wouldn't be safe if they build houses for like a lot of people with like no knowledge of like physics or something, because you probably need to like know structures to even like build mass housing, right?
Right. Okay. So a good point. And it's not like okay. Even actually, to be fair to Goodman, he is not saying that there is no role for any kind of any kind of systematic knowledge about things. So you need engineers. Because I mean, things like structural integrity, for instance, is important when you build something. You need planners because you need to understand questions of access to infrastructure and distribution and so on. So those things are important. But what he's saying essentially, and which is the point, is that planning is different from a planner. Planning is not something that is only something that planners can do. Planning is something that anybody can do if you have the knowledge. So it's about he's questioning the idea of the professional, not the idea of the discipline or the knowledge. And that's important. So the profession is, and the process of education to create a professional is the process of acquiring credentials and status, and also cultivating certain tastes. But he's not saying that the knowledge itself is rubbish, so that anything that anybody builds is okay. That's not what he's saying. What he's saying is that the idea that the professional is the only person who knows, because first of all, it's not even true that professionals know. There are lousy professionals around. And the other thing is there are many who are not professionals who also have a very good sense of the trades. So what he's trying to question is the social legitimacy of professionals, not necessarily the importance of the knowledge of a particular trade or craft or science and so on. I hope that addresses the thing. But in any case, I mean, if I were to ask you very broadly, if you had to reflect on your own education of architecture, and what are the things that you think you learn when you are being trained to become an architect, what would those be?
Hussein, I have comment on earlier point कि हम लोग जब ऐसे बात एज ए प्रोफेशनल ना, अगर हम लोगों को काम करना है तो हम लोग ऐसे नहीं कह सकते कि हम लोगों के लिए डिजाइन नहीं करना चाहिए। मुझे ऐसा लगता है कि हमारा काम एक्चुअली प्रिजर्व करना है। मतलब अभी बहुत जगह देख रहा है कि अच्छे पुराने वर्नाक्युलर हाउसेस तोड़ निकल के लोग आरसीसी की बिल्डिंग वगैरह बना रहे हैं और आर्किटेक्ट उनको प्लान दे रहा है। तो हम लोग ऐसे भी कर सकते हैं कि अगर हम लोग एज ए प्रोफेशनल ट्रेन है आर्किटेक्चर, तो हम लोग को एक वो पर्सपेक्टिव होना चाहिए कि हमें दिखे कि लोगों के पास क्या अच्छा है, या मतलब जो नेचुरल जो डिजाइन इमर्ज होता है ना लोगों से इवोल्यूशन की तरह धीरे धीरे, तो हम लोगों को उसको ऐसे ऐसे नहीं किसी ने करना है कि वो हमारा उसके साथ कंपटीशन है। एक्चुअली हमें ऐसे ट्रीट करना चाहिए कि अपना रिस्पॉन्सिबिलिटी कि हमें वो कंजर्व करना है ऐसा। तो
very important point, Sham, because if you look at the work of Patrick Geddes, which we discussed earlier, he actually talks about it like, what Geddes' approach is not that the architect and planner actually is a kind of a gardener. He's not a person who would erase everything and build completely new. He's not somebody who's kind of solving a Lego puzzle. It's somebody who's like a gardener who will identify what is of value, keep it, preserve it, improve it. Identify what works and what does not. What does not work, maybe you can replace. What works, you will retain. So it is a kind of a conservationist approach to architecture rather than a approach where everything that exists is unworthy and it has to be removed. And then in your mind and your thought is going to create a completely new thing in its place. So what Sham is saying essentially is something that is also a tradition in architecture of being a conservationist, essentially, not necessarily doing a demolition job everywhere you go. But that's not shared by a lot of architects, and especially with the modern kind of commercial imperatives in architecture where, for instance, land speculation, which Robert Goodman also mentioned, where it is the value of land that decides what gets built rather than the question of how people live. Like if you walk around in JVPD scheme, you will see all of these buildings suddenly doubling and tripling in height, where, okay, the planners will say that we are building more houses, but actually what is happening is that the land values have increased so much that the older houses seem to be not fulfilling the full value of that land. And so there is quite commercial pressure to redevelop and so on. So that is essentially what is shaping architecture. Most architects who pass out from architecture schools don't do the kind of architecture that you do in schools. You work for big architecture firms who are essentially, in the business of real estate, not so much in the business of making an aesthetically or socially enriching built environment. So these are the realities of the discipline as well, or the profession as well, which is something that all of these writings tend to point towards. Yeah.
However, there have been architects. Like for instance, if you look at Geddes, Geddes was not an architect, but he practiced planning. But if you look at Christopher Alexander, so his research was also not so much about design, but he was trying to kind of distill these clues from historic or vernacular side of urban or rural environments, and he kind of created a pattern language, right, which architects could use. So he also said that there is a lot that architects can learn from these simple buildings that ordinary people have created over centuries, and there are certain patterns which they which maybe arise out of common sense, maybe out of evolve over time, as a result of day-to-day practices and the practicality of how certain places function. And so he kind of then documents this to create a kind of a knowledge which architects can then use in their design. What generally tends to happen is that architects, because of the nature of practice and this architects and professionals tend to become more egoistic in that sense, the way Corbusier was, for instance. It's about creating a new language, a new statement, kind of, saying, I'm kind of different from everybody else, I have nothing to learn from the past, or, so it's almost like, or even following the current or latest fashions, so out of architectural magazines, or, what seems fashionable at that point. So that seems to dictate your architectural imagination or expression more than simple, very practical, ordinary things. And I think those are the values that Patrick Geddes and certain practitioners, or even Laurie Baker, who works in Kerala and was working with trying to look at low-cost housing and looking at the practicality of materials, etc. So if you look at the nature of certain practices, you see that it is more about informed by the ordinary, or the everyday, as opposed to trying to create some statement, or kind of trying to fulfill some requirements of what is fashionable, or kind of contemporary.
Yeah. And to add to that, actually, fulfill requirements of what is fashionable, what is contemporary, what sells, and so on, to things like big projects like the Central Vista, which is about basically doing the bidding of the people who have hired you, to create monuments for the elite, so even that, a lot of professionals. So you will find, if you look at the architecture profession, a whole variety of practices, from people like Laurie Baker and Hassan Fathy and others, who learned from how people live and applied those ideas in their own practices, working with people, to people on the other extreme like Bimal and so on, and Hafiz and so on, who kind of work for big clients and big powerful institutions and so on. So there is a diversity, and you can learn from from this whole range and see what actually is something that appeals to you as an architect. Okay, next. Who wants to read this? Okay, I'll read it. One second, I'll just zoom in. Yeah. We found that we shared a sense that what makes an environment right for man is more than either its aesthetic qualities or its technical appropriateness, or even a combination of the two. That it is important also that an environment respond to us, that we have been able to make it ours. In this view, the means of making and controlling are tied together in experience with their physical product, and aesthetic judgments are and must be penetrated by human meanings and relevance. As a friend wrote to one of us, the point of view is that the world of art and the world of society are not separate, that there is only one world in which we all live and in which our activities take place. Our sense of any single activity can only be made rational by our sense of the whole. This requires us to look at the city, its neighborhoods, and its dwellings as not simply artifacts or as the format of human activity, but as a vehicle and expression of our human life, which, being human, is also communal, in the Greek sense, political. John Turner, in his further study of the settlements of Lima, declares that the squatter Barida builder who chooses to invest his life's savings in an environment that he creates forms himself in the process. The person, as a member of a family and of a local community, finds in the responsibilities and activities of home building and local improvement a creative dialogue essential for self-discovery and growth. The Barida is ground for living that the house unit, marketed or allocated by mass consumption society, does not provide. And in telling assertion of the libertarian significance of dweller control, Turner declares, the man who would be free must build his own life. The existential value of the Barida is the product of three freedoms: the freedom of community self-selection, the freedom to budget one's own resources, and the freedom to shape one's own environment. And he concludes that the mass of the urban poor in cities like Lima are able to seek and find improvement through home ownership or de facto possession when they are still very poor by modern standards is certainly the main reason for their optimism. If they were trapped in the inner cities, like so many of the North American poor, they would be burning instead of building. The mass-designed, mass-produced environments for an increasingly homogenized market of mass consumers are no more than assemblies of material goods devoid of existential meaning. They are not the product of dialogue. Decisions are made for a producer's market by those themselves bound by highly institutionalized norms and procedures. The occupant buys or rents already made unit in much the same way as he gets his motor car or his TV set. And if it is a flat or in a tightly controlled subdivision, he can do little more with his house than he can with the other manufactured goods essential to his way of life. The intense dialogue that takes place between the squatters' planning and invasion and the continuing dialogue of its development and administration are, with rare exception, totally lacking in the modern housing process. Okay. Anybody wants to summarize this or respond to this? Okay, so he is, so this Colin Watt here is actually talking mostly about John Turner and John Turner's work. And this is the last paragraph is an important passage where he talks about the three freedoms of the built environment that John Turner talks about, which is the freedom of community self-selection, the freedom to budget one's own resources, and the freedom to shape one's own environment. And these three freedoms, if you notice, all of us who live in housing that has been built by someone else, we don't have this. We don't have community self-selection. We have individual self-selection. You go and choose your own house. You don't go as a community and select your own house or, decide where and how you want to build. The freedom to budget one's own resources. You don't, pool in money, make decisions about, okay, how much you should spend, who you should get, and so on. And finally, the freedom to decide how your environment should be shaped, to design it. Even that you don't have, So you choose from a market where things are already built and made. So there is a notion of freedom in the marketplace. And this is kind of celebrated quite a lot. It's the idea that capitalist society creates individual freedom. Yeah, in a limited sense, it is true, in that you can go and whatever how much ever money you have, you can decide to spend it the way you want. You're not driven by scarcity in the sense that, the decisions about what you consume are made by somebody else. So in that sense, you have the freedom, but you only have the freedom insofar as that freedom is provided in the marketplace. You can choose between 2 or 3 different models of cars, but you cannot decide to design and make your own. You can choose 2 or 3 different models of computers, but you cannot build your own. Or if you want to build it, it is incredibly difficult to do, because you don't have the knowledge, you don't have the tools, you also don't have the parts, So this is a limited kind of freedom that the market gives you. But when you are an author of your own built environment, you do many more things that the buyers of houses don't do. And that is the idea of freedom to build or housing being a verb and so on. So essentially that is what he's talking about. Colin Ward, one important thing to talk about here is that he says it's an anarchist approach. Okay, now what does that mean? An anarchist approach is an approach which is one which doesn't rely on the centralized forces, state institutions, nor does it rely on the capitalist market. It relies on collective, communal ways of doing things, where people come together and decide what they want to build and how they want to do it and so on. So, for instance, a farm which is collectively owned and whatever is produced on it, people collectively share and they work together. And you can think about that not just in as a question of farms, but you can also see it in a way in some firms and organizations where people, worker-owned enterprise. You must have heard of the India Coffee House, which is a very famous example of a workers' collective, where people who work there actually collectively own and share the profits of that organization. You don't have owners and workers as two separate ideas. There's a very large company in Spain called Mondragon Collective, which is actually owned collectively by all the workers, and there are many more examples of this. So this idea that you have people can together make decisions that that affect their lives is what is meant by an anarchist approach. So how would you do housing like that? That is essentially what Colin Ward is asking in this essay. Okay. Chalo, any questions or comments, or we can close? Now? Shravan is very quiet today for some reason. Okay. Then let's stop. Next week, probably we'll be doing the Just City. And we'll, as usual, we'll upload the readings a few hours before the class. And if you guys want to do the 13th session on a free discussion, please start thinking about what kind of questions you would want to raise for discussion. So it's basically it's a class that you guys will be doing. We will be attending that class. You will be the ones who will be organizing that class. So think about it, and you can decide how you want to do it. All right? Okay. See you guys. Take care. Bye.
Thank you.